Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the first 5 chapters of the book of Genesis in our survey of the Old Testament. First of all, we ought to notice, just because this is the beginning of our survey, that we're finding ourselves in what the Jews would call the Torah, the Greeks would call the Pentateuch. The word Torah means a law or instruction in Hebrew. The word Pentateuch, which corresponds to the same first 5 books, is from the Greek language, and it just means the 5-part book, which this is. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Genesis is going to be the book that starts off with the creation and takes us through the growth and development of the promise of God to his people through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the way to the point where the Israelites enter into Egypt. And so it's going to begin with creation, and it will end with the Israelites going into Egypt. Exodus then is going to pick up there several hundred years later, and it will take us from the deliverance from Egypt as the Israelites come out of Egypt, and then God brings them to Mount Sinai, where there is the establishment of his covenant with them. The end of the book of Exodus will be when they finally build the tabernacle according to the commands of God, and God, as it were, the presence of God moves into the building, moves into the tabernacle. Leviticus then will take up there at the tabernacle and will give the laws of worship as to what you are to do now that you have the tabernacle. Here's what you are to do with it. The book of Numbers, you would think it's going to be about Numbers, but it's really not. The book of Numbers is going to tell us all about the wilderness wanderings while the Israelites are in the wilderness, beginning there with the tabernacle at Mount Sinai, all the way to when they are ready to enter into the promised land a good 38 years later. But before they enter in, they are given the law again, and that will be the book of Deuteronomy, where the law is given again to the new generation with a special emphasis to those who are about to enter the land. Now, we ought to also mention, concerning all 5 of these books, a theory that has been developed. I believe it's a wrong theory, called the documentary hypothesis. This hypothesis noted that early on in the book of Genesis and continuing throughout all 5 books, sometimes you have the name of God. It is, in English we sometimes refer to that as Jehovah. They didn't actually have the letter J in Hebrew, so probably sounded a little bit more like Yahweh, versus the title for God. The way you say the word God in Hebrew is Elohim. And sometimes as you're reading through, for example, in Genesis chapter 1, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and the word there for God is Elohim. But then when you get to chapter 2, there's a change, and instead of God just being referred to as Elohim, he is now being referred to as Jehovah Elohim, or Yahweh Elohim, or as the Jews often say, Adonai Eloheinu, the Lord our God. And so it was noted that these different terms were used. Now, a fellow by the name of Jean Astruc, back in the 1700s, noting this diversity of names, theorized that perhaps when Moses was sitting to write down, Genesis, and later he would write Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but when he was writing Genesis, those events of which he was not a eyewitness because they had taken place hundreds of years before his birth, Astruc theorized that perhaps Moses utilized 2 different sets of source documents. That is, oftentimes when even a biblical writer, when they write, they actually have certain written records before them that they are utilizing. Nothing wrong with that. The book of Joshua actually mentions one such source document, where at the time when Joshua commands the sun to stand still in Joshua chapter 10, the writer says, by the way, this is also written in the book of Jasher. And then there's a short little quote from this unknown book of Jasher. It's not a book that we knew, but it was a book that the author back then would have had, a document that he would have had at his disposal. And so Astruc is theorizing that as Moses is writing, he has at least 2 different source documents, one of which might have used the name Elohim, the other which might have used the name Jehovah, or perhaps use them both together like are found, for example, in Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3, Jehovah Elohim. And that's entirely possible. This theory was modified a bit later by Wilhelm de Witt, who who looked at that as a way to explain not just Genesis, but Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. But he came to Deuteronomy, says it just doesn't seem to work there. Deuteronomy has some different things to it, and so he theorized that Deuteronomy was penned by an alternate author. So you have, when we're talking about source documents, the Jehovah author, per se, the Elohim author, and now the Deuteronomy author. I'm not sure that theory had that much to commend itself. I think there are some differences in Deuteronomy, but when we get there, we're going to see why they are there. I think they're there for a different, altogether reason. The theory continued to develop as Hermann Hohlfeld, again we're going a bit later, by the way, by now we're in the 1800s, who said, well, that Elohim theory doesn't quite fit all the observations, and so he theorized maybe there was two different Elohim authors, an E1 and an E2. We're just using that as shorthand. And finally, the theory was changed again, but this time popularized by Julius Wellhausen, a German scholar, who on the heels of Darwin's theory of evolution tried to apply those same sort of Darwinian evolutionary beliefs to the makeup and the origins of the Old Testament, in particular to the Torah, that is the Pentateuch, these first 5 books. And Wellhausen, he was borrowing on these other earlier scholars, and he postulated that there was first that Jehovah author, of which we have mentioned, that uses Jehovah. That secondly, there was the Elohim author. Thirdly, there was the Deuteronomy author. We can see there's nothing new in this theory so far, but he also envisioned what he called the priestly author. That is, whenever you see lots of numbers or all those priestly sorts of things about sacrifices, that must have been a different author, again, according to Wellhausen. Now let me say, I think the theory has been debunked on a number of fronts. The chief way that I'm going to deal with it, as we read through Genesis, we're going to see that there are entire units that fit together in a chiastic pattern that ignore this theory. In other words, the theory just doesn't match up. And there's large chunks, not just a little portion here, whole major sections of Genesis, the entire Abraham narrative, the entire Jacob narrative. Just ignore this sort of thing, which means that the theory itself just falls apart. The other thing the theory was trying to do was trying to say, well, all these different parts were written hundreds and hundreds of years after Moses, some perhaps even 1,000 years after Moses. And again, I don't think that is the case. First of all, we have portions now, very small portions, but portions of the Pentateuch that go back to, not all the way to Moses' day. We don't have any original document, but we have at least one that goes back all the way to what might have been David's day, far earlier than this theory postulated. And so I think the theory has come to ruination, although not everybody realizes that, and maybe it is still being taught in a few colleges. Well, enough about that. Let's go to Genesis, the book of beginnings. Genesis itself is divided into 2 major sections. First of all, there's chapters 1 through 11, where there are 4 major events that are predominant. And those events are the creation, the fall into sin, the flood in the days of Noah, and finally the Tower of Babel. And those are those 4 major events. You want to remember those. The second part of Genesis, beginning in chapter 12 and running to the end of the book, is 50 chapters in Genesis, are going to have 4 people who are predominant. Now, there are other people mentioned, but these are the 4 big stories. They are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph. The sons of Jacob are there, but the Joseph narrative is predominant. It takes sort of first place in that latter part. So, the first part of Genesis deals with 4 major events. The second part of Genesis deal with 4 major people. The first section is looking at the human race as a whole. Now, when I say that, there are certain parts, like at the creation and the fall, where the human race is only dealing with 2 people. But it expands from that very quickly, and then we have the entire human race in the flood, although we're focused primarily upon Noah and his family. And again, the Tower of Babel, that's the human race as a whole. In the second section, where people are predominant, we are focused only upon the family of Abraham. We will not be looking at too many people. There are a great many people on the earth by that time, great many civilizations. We won't be looking at any of those except as they relate to the family of Abraham. The first section, chapters 1 through 11, and notice that's a shorter section, it's only 11 chapters long, it spans 2,000 plus years of history. The second section is a much shorter period, and yet there are many more chapters given over to it, so that is where the major emphasis of the book of Genesis lies, on the family of Abraham, in this much shorter period. This period, if we go all the way to the birth of Abraham to the end of Joseph, that's about 250 years. Now we start off in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we see several things. First of all, notice the who of creation. In the beginning, God created. We are not told anything about who God is, 5 points on why we know that God exists, any of that. God is assumed to exist. There is a presupposition that is presented that God is there, and we're just going to take the stance that he is there, and he creates the heavens and the earth. So God is seen initially as the creator. First of all, secondly, we want to see the work of creation. He's creating heavens and earth. We're not told how he does this. Elsewhere in the scriptures, we see him speaking things into existence, and actually that's going to come into being later on in this chapter as well. But this single initial act of creation, and I take it as such. Yes, there are some scholars who have wanted to say when in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and this is all the things that he did to bring that about. I think that's reading in something into the text that really isn't there. A strictly literal translation of this is going to be, as we have it here in the English, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So God comes on the scene. He's already on the scene. The scene actually comes into being as he creates the heavens and the earth. And the what of creation, notice, it's the heavens. Now, the word heavens, shamayim, is always in the plural. I suspect that it comes from the root word sham, which just means over there. So perhaps we could, and I'm stretching this a little bit, perhaps we could say God created the up there places and the down here place. The heavens up there and the earth down here. And heaven isn't necessarily up, because it depends on what portion of the earth that you're speaking of. Everything's sort of up, I guess. But it's speaking in a geocentric sort of way. He created the down here, the earth, or you could translate that elsewhere. We're going to translate to that the land. Haaretz can be both the earth, the whole planet, or it can be this portion of the earth, the land. So he created the up there and the down here, the heavens up there and the land down here. The passage goes on to say, and the earth was unformed and unfilled, and I'm underscoring that because we're going to come back and look at those two words. The earth was unformed and unfilled, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Now, notice, as the earth is created, we could say it's only half-baked. It's not done yet. There's more that needs to be done, and that's going to take us through the rest of this chapter, and it is unformed and unfilled. Now we take those words, unformed and unfilled, and that actually brings us the heading, the two headings, of the rest of this chapter. So that in verse 3, we see God saying, let there be light, and there was light, and that becomes the first day, evening and morning, day one, as the Hebrew says so succinctly. And when we come to day 2, now we see water and sky being divided, a division between the waters that are under the firmament versus those that are over the firmament, or as the New American Standard translates it, the expanse, we could say the sky. And there's a division between water and sky, and then in on day 3, dry land appears, and vegetation is brought forth. And God does all this. What he is doing on day 1 and day 2 and day 3, he is forming those things that are unformed, making division where there needs to be division between water and sky, and between dry land and the seas, and bringing forth vegetation. And now on days 4, 5, and 6, he is going to fill that which he formed on day 1, 2, and 3. Let's see how this plays out. On day 4, he brings the light bearers. See how that corresponds to the creation of light, which was on day 1. Now on day 4, those things that give light, the sun, the moon, and the stars, are all described as being brought about by God. On day 5, we have the things that go in the water and the sky, which were divided on day 2. Now God fills them. He fills the water with fish. He fills the sky with birds. And on day 3, where we saw the dry land and vegetation corresponding to that, now on day 6, we have the things that go on dry land, the land animals, and mankind. So that there is a orderly pattern to the description of creation where he forms his creation, he forms that which he had made, and then he, on the days 4, 5, and 6, he fills that creation. And on the 7th day, God stops, he rests, not that because he's tired, but because he's done, the work of creation is completed. And so God rests on the Sabbath and sets that forth as a continuing observance, a continuing ordinance that's going to run us through the Old Testament, and I think it's going to run us through the New Testament too, although the nature of the Sabbath is going to change a bit because there's going to be a new creation that is going to be observed coming in the New Testament. But that's a long way away, so we're not going to go there quite yet. Now I want to focus a bit on Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, day 6, where God said, "Let us make man in our image." You notice the plural pronoun. Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. And of course, scholars have wondered, what is that plural about? Where God has been doing things, Now it's true that the word God, Elohim, is itself a plural, but in almost every case, except a few places in Genesis, and this is one of those 3 places, once here in Genesis 1, once in Genesis chapter 3, once in Genesis chapter 11, but every other place we see God doing something, and then when the pronoun comes, it is, and God said, and he did this, and he did that. So it always comes, almost always, with a singular pronoun, even though the word Elohim, the word God, strictly speaking, it's plural. But because it's plural and comes with a singular pronoun when it's referring to God, then we don't think of it as God's plural, but it's rather God, but it has this plural form to it. Now, usually when we see that with the name Elohim, we don't think in terms of God's plural, unless the context is giving us that, but rather we think of God as being spoken of in such a grand and great manner that we have in the Hebrew a form which is known as the plural of majesty. That is when you want to describe something really big, like the heavens. You never say Shema, the heaven singular. It's always Shemaim. It's there and there. And so there's here a plural of majesty. Let us make man in our image. And it seems to be that might be why we are seeing the plural in the pronoun as well. Now, to be fair, not all scholars agree. There are some who think maybe there's a suggestion here of the Trinity. And I have to admit that might be true. Although when Jesus wants to point out that Trinitarian idea, he's going to turn us to a different passage over in the Psalms, and when we get there, we'll look at that. So I do agree with the theology of the Trinity. I'm just not sure that this is the passage that points that out, even in hinting form. So God said, "Let us make man in our image." By the way, the Jewish idea was that maybe God was speaking to the angels. But I don't think the rest of the context underscores that, because notice God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness," and some have wondered what's the difference between image and likeness. Just 2 ways of describing essentially the same thing. I think this is typical Hebrew parallelism. According to our image, or in our image, according to our likeness, let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Verse 27, and God created man not in his image and the image of the angels, but rather God created man in his own image. And notice this time the singular pronoun. Not their own image, his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. So both man and woman, and this is summed up in this verse. In chapter 2 we're going to have a delineation how those divisions came to be, how God first created man, and then he created woman. But here it's all stated in one summary statement. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. He repeats it just in case you didn't miss that, in case you didn't get it. He wants to emphasize it. And then male and female, he created them. Verse 28, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over every living thing that moves on the earth. Now, it's often asked, in what way was man made in the image of God? What does that mean? And a number of different answers have been given, and there probably are a number of correct answers, but within the context of Genesis, here in chapter 1, there's really only one, and it's given here in verse 28, here in the context. That is, man is made in the image of God, in the sense that, notice, man is told, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. That idea of subduing the earth, that's something that man is doing as a representative of God. It is as if God is deputizing man. I'm putting you here in my image, and you're going to do my work. You're sort of going to act in my place as my representative, as my deputy, and you are going to rule over the earth as I rule over all creation. Notice also there's this idea of federal headship, that man is God's representative. He is head over all the earth as God is head over all creation. And that means when man falls into sin, he will be representing all the earth, so that all the earth will be said to have fallen into sin. Sin will come upon planet Earth. Romans chapter 8 talks about how the entire creation, the down here, the entire world, everything you see, labors and groans under the fall, because when man fell, creation fell as well. I also want you to see here that because man is the representative of God over creation, that man has been given a stewardship, and if he is the steward of a world that God has made, then we Christians have a basis for ecology. We ought to take care of the world with which God has entrusted us. It is not our world. It is a world that has been given to us for our safekeeping. It is God's world, and we are his stewards. Now, as we come to chapter 2, we're going to see a second account of creation, and that brings up the question, why are there two separate accounts of creation? And I want to suggest to you that the book of Genesis is regularly going to give this pattern. We'll have, in a sense, two accounts of a number of events, where first we are given the overview, sort of the big picture, and then we go back and we look at that important part that the author really wants to bring home to us. And I think that's true of creation. I think it's true of the flood. I think it's going to be true of a number of narratives within this book. So, as we look at Genesis chapters 1 and chapter 2, I think we can see something of a contrast. Genesis chapter 1, we have the heavens and the earth. They're created in 6 days. In chapter 2, we're going to look at the creation of man and the woman, and no time element will be mentioned. Obviously, that's going to focus mostly on the 6th day, but that's not going to be mentioned here. It's already been mentioned back in Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis chapter 1, we see the panorama of creation as a whole. In Genesis chapter 2, there is a detailed focus on one particular aspect of creation, that is, on the creation of man and woman and the things that God says and does with them. In Genesis chapter 1, that centers on God creating the heavens and the earth and the whole panorama. In Genesis chapter 2, it centers on man as the crowning act of God's creation, and that is its focus. When we come to Genesis chapter 2, I want you to see that it's going to give us the pattern. I'm going to give you an outline just of Genesis chapter 2, and I want you to see the detailed pattern in the same way we saw a pattern in Genesis 1, sort of a parallel pattern. This is a different type of pattern. We start off in this is all chapter 2, in verses 1 through 3, where creation has been completed. The heavens and earth are created, God finishes his work, he rests on the 7th day, he declares it to be the Sabbath, and that is given as a continuing ordinance. Next we see the creation of man, beginning in verses 4 through 9, where man is created, and he is formed from the dust of the ground. That hadn't been mentioned back in chapter 1. It's mentioned now. And man is created. He's formed of the dust of the ground. He becomes a living soul. Next, we have the description of trees and rivers that come through the garden. And names are given to both certain trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's a preview of things to come. And then rivers are mentioned, 4 different rivers that flow out of the garden, and they are named. Now, when we look at the names of the rivers that come out of the garden, some of them are familiar to us. For example, the Euphrates and the Tigris we know by name. And if this is the same rivers, now it could well be that the rivers that flew out of the garden were not the same rivers that we know as the Euphrates and the Tigris, and that these 2 names were given to other rivers, maybe after the flood. If that's the case, then we would have no idea where they are. But these 2 rivers they flow side by side through the land of Mesopotamia, so they were well known to everyone living there. And notice those 2 rivers as I look toward the southeast corner of my map. I see where they come together. That's the traditional location of Eden. But also they begin not in the exact same place, but in the same general area, far to the north, on the north side of our map, in a land that was called Urartu. The Bible will refer to that land as Ararat. That's the place where the Ark of Noah is going to land. So our traditional location of Eden, most folk will tend to look at southern Mesopotamia, the place where Eden is. But I have to wonder sometimes, at least to consider, whether Eden might not have been meant to be located in that northern area where these 2 rivers have their source, where both the Tigris and the Euphrates begin. And frankly, I just have to say, I don't know. Our story continues where man is assigned the task of guarding and keeping the garden. That's in verse 15. And then in verse 16, we read about the forbidden fruit. So we say in verse 16, the Lord God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely. By the way, that's including the tree of life. But from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it, you shall surely die. The Hebrew says, die and you will die, but that's not referring to death. That's the way you say in Hebrew. It's really going to happen. You shall surely die. So the translation is correct. It is accurate. Next we see that, and by the way, verses 16 and 17, that's the pivotal point. Next we see that man is in need of a helper, to do his task. He had been assigned the task of guarding and keeping the garden in verse 15. Now in verse 18, he needs a helper. We read that it's not good for him to be alone. God says, I'm going to make a helper for him. But the next thing that happens isn't the creation of the woman, but instead we have a naming section, again, just like we had in verses 9 through 14, where the trees and the rivers in the garden were given names. So now all the animals in the garden are brought to the man, and they are given names, and it's his job to name them. Next, we have the woman being created. She is formed not from the dust of the ground, but from a rib that is taken from the man. He is put to sleep, and in his sleep, God performs some sort of surgical operation, takes the rib, and from that fashions the woman. And our chapter comes to an end where, again, creation is complete. And this time we see the man and the woman. They are naked. They're unashamed. You get the idea. They're with God. They're in the presence of God. And everything is good. It doesn't say so, but you get that idea with the culmination of this chapter. Now we come to the 3rd chapter, and problems arise. Remember, the serpent enters the picture, and the serpent deceives the woman. He says, it's okay for you to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Your eyes are going to be opened, and everything will be fine. God, didn't tell the truth. And the woman believes the lie, verse 6 of chapter 3, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. People wonder, where was Adam when the temptation was going on? We're not told, but here we're told she gave to her husband with her. Maybe he was with her the whole time. That's entirely possible. We don't read about him being anywhere else. But she is the one who is deceived. She's the one who falls into temptation. Now, it's the serpent that instigated it all, but she falls into temptation. And Adam goes along with it for whatever reason. We're not given his motivation. And they both fall into sin. Now, what are the results from their actions of taking and eating the forbidden fruit? Well, immediately we read that their eyes were opened. There's something about them that are changed. And as you first read that, the serpent had said, if you eat it, your eyes are going to be opened and you're going to know good and evil and you'll be like God. Well, their eyes were opened. There was an element of truth to the serpent's statement, his promise. But, one of the things that, you have lies and then you have really bad lies, and then you have half-truths, which are lies that are dressed up as if they're the truth. And that's what the serpent had told. He had told a half-truth, a partial truth. Where it's true that their eyes were open, but they weren't like God. They were actually fallen now in a way very different from God. And God shows up, and he questions first of all, the man and woman they're hiding. They're trying to do fig leaves and things like that. But he questions them, and then he questions the serpent, and then he says to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and he, that is the seed of the woman, he shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Notice the seed. Normally we think of seed as can refer to a bunch of people, and that's true, but ultimately the seed is going to come down to one person. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Now, this is going to set up a contrast that runs through the rest of the Bible. We're going to see how it runs through the rest of the Bible, but first I want you to see how it runs through the book of Genesis. The seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman. I said ultimately that's one person. Ultimately, the seed of the serpent is the one that I believe, even though he's not mentioned anywhere in the book of Genesis, I still believe he was the power behind the serpent, because, serpents can't talk. I'm not sure if they could even talk back then. But this serpent was able to. And I think the reason why is because there was a power behind the serpent. And you don't see who he is until you get all the way to the book of Revelation, chapter 12, where the book of Revelation in chapter 12, it talks about that old serpent, the devil. And so I think the power behind the serpent was Satan. But Satan's not named anywhere in the book of Genesis. And so we have the seed of the serpent, ultimately one individual, one person, if I can call him that. And ultimately, I think the seed of the woman is ultimately going to point to the seed, the he, who will do that crushing. I think it ultimately points to Jesus Christ. However, before I get there, I want you to see how a pattern plays out in the book of Genesis. You see, I go to the next chapter, and I have Cain and Abel being born. And it's not too long before there is a conflict taking place, not on Abel's part, but on Cain's part, where Cain kills Abel. And of course the question comes out, how is the Cain and Abel narrative related to the larger story of Genesis? It is setting forth a pattern between two seeds, because even though both of these sons, Cain and Abel, are born from Adam and Eve, there is a sense in which we can look at Cain as, spiritually speaking, not physically, but spiritually, he is the seed. So we have Abel on the one hand, representing the seed of the woman, and Cain, even though he's Abel's brother, even though he's also born of the woman, physically, but spiritually speaking, he's acting very serpent-like, if I can call him that. He's acting the part of the enemy of the seed of the woman. And he murders Abel. And then what follows in the rest of Genesis chapter 4 is a genealogy, where we find Abel, he goes forth, he's banished from the area, and he has descendants, and they build a city, and they have sons, and they have sons, and they have sons. And we go down 7 generations, and we come to somebody named Lamech, who also kills somebody, but instead of saying, I wish I hadn't done that, or my punishment is too great, he writes a song to brag about it. He says, if God was going to avenge Cain, if anybody messed with him sevenfold, I'm going to avenge them 70 times sevenfold. I'm the really bad guy. So we see the seed of the serpent grows and develops. And then we look to Genesis chapter 5, the next chapter, and there is now, actually at the end of chapter 4, we read that Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son, and named him Seth, for she said, God has sethed me, that is, appointed me, another offspring in the place of Abel, for Cain killed him. Now that's even stronger in the Hebrew text, where when we read that phrase, another offspring, literally, it's saying, he has appointed me another seed. So it is taking the seed idea and developing it further in the rest of the book of Genesis. So I went from Abel has died, and so instead I'm following the line through Seth, and I go down I went down 7 generations from Cain to Lamech, and here's a guy who murdered somebody and brags about it. I go 7 generations from Seth to Enoch, and Enoch is one who, by contrast with Lamech, Enoch walks with God. And his personality or his ministry or his whatever is of such a nature that he does not die. With every person leading up to him, we would read he lived so many years, he had sons and daughters, and then he died. So many years, sons and daughters, and then he died. We get Enoch, lived so many years, sons and daughters, and he did not die. He was not, for God took him. It's as if they're walking along, and God says, hey, we're pretty close to my place. Why don't we just go to my place instead today? And Enoch is taken by God, but not dying and taken by God. He doesn't die. But he does have sons and daughters, and we continue through the seed of the woman all the way down to Noah. And Noah finds grace in the eyes of the Lord, even though the world by now is going to be judged and destroyed by a flood so that all mankind will perish. Noah and his family are going to be saved. And so we read about the children of Noah. Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and they are all saved in the ark. Once they have come out of the ark, there's going to be another story that takes place where we see the promise continues through Shem, and he's going to be that seed of the woman. It will be ultimately through Shem that we're even going to see Abraham. But another son comes to prominence, and that is the son Ham, who sins. He disrespects his father, and in an honor and shame culture, that was a very big idea. Today we say, oh, big deal. It's a little road bump maybe. But in that day, honor and shame were everything. So to disrespect your father, that was as bad as it could be. And Ham disrespects his father. And Noah puts a curse, not on Ham, but on one of Ham's sons, on Canaan. Now, if you were reading this passage, we read it and it looks like just a bunch of names. If you were reading this passage as it was originally written, Moses writing to the Israelites, who you remember are about to go into the land of Canaan as the promised land, and they will be called to go in and bring the judgment of God upon the land of Canaan, suddenly this section takes an entirely new emphasis. This is very personable to them. They will be going into Canaan. Canaan's land will be their land. So when a curse is put on Canaan, that becomes especially significant to the original readers of this book. Notice the seed of the woman continues on from Shem, finally to Abraham. Now we need to move our chart up because the story is going to continue even once we get to Abraham, because Abraham is going to have a son. His son will be Isaac, that is the promised son. But before Abraham has Isaac, there's going to be an older son, a son not born of Abraham's wife Sarah, but a son born of Sarah's handmaiden. And his name is going to be Ishmael. And it's not that Ishmael is a bad guy, but he's not the promised seed. So there's a sense in which he comes under the heading of the seed of the serpent. Now, I don't want to pick on Ishmael, but the same pattern is continuing where the older son, just like Cain with the older son is set aside, and it's the promise goes instead of the younger son, which was very cross-cultural in that day. The older son normally got everything. But God is choosing the younger son, Isaac, to be the seed of the woman. And Isaac's going to have 2 sons, and what's more, they are going to be twins. And there is Jacob, and there is also Esau. And even though Esau is the older son, Esau is willing to give away his birthright. He's not quite all that interested in the things of the Lord. So you get the idea that spiritually speaking, and again, I'm not saying he's a bad person, morally bad, but I am saying he's not that interested in the things of the Lord, and so spiritually speaking, he represents the seed of the serpent. And I think the question that we are meant to ask, I think the question that the children of Israel are meant to ask, is not physically, but spiritually speaking, whose seed are you? And when we get to the New Testament, we read about how we have been born again, not of corruptible seed, not of physical seed, but of that which is spiritual, through the abiding Word of God. Whose seed are you? Have you been born again? Have you come to Jesus Christ in faith, trusting in what He did for you, aligning yourself with Him through faith, who is the ultimate seed? Because that is what determines the answer to this question: whose seed are you?